friends. Today, as most of you know, we come to the third lecture in our present series. As you know, in this series, which is a comparatively short one, we are dealing with the meaning of conversion in Buddhism. In the first lecture, we discussed this phenomenon or this experience of conversion in terms of going for refuge. Going for refuge, that is to say, to the Buddha, the enlightened one, to the Dharma, the teaching of the path or way to enlightenment, and to the Sangha, to the community of those actually treading that path or way leading to enlightenment. In other words, in the course of this first lecture, we discussed the meaning of conversion in Buddhism more from the point of view of conversion to Buddhism. Now, last week, you may remember, we discussed the same subject in different terms, in terms of what is known technically in Buddhism as stream entry. Conversion, as it were, from the conditioned to the unconditioned, from the round of samsara to the spiral which leads ultimately to nirvana. So this was, as it were, conversion within Buddhism. So having considered, having discussed, having tried to understand conversion in the sense of going for refuge, conversion to Buddhism, conversion in the sense of entering the stream, conversion within Buddhism, going from the conditioned to the unconditioned, the round to the spiral, one might think that it's hardly possible to go further than this. And in a sense, though only in a sense, it isn't possible to go further than this. But we are not only dealing with this subject of conversion in Buddhism, as it were, on different levels, we're also dealing with it under different aspects or from different points of view. So today, this evening, we come to yet another aspect of the whole question, the whole problem. Today, we propose to discuss conversion in Buddhism in terms of what is known as the Bodhicitta Utpada, or the arising of the will to enlightenment. Now here, there is in a sense a difference of level, and also, one may say, a difference of aspect. And both, I hope, will become clear to us in the course of the lecture. Now, the first question which arises naturally is, what exactly is meant by Bodhicitta Utpada, which I provisionally rendered as the arising of the will to enlightenment? First of all, what is the meaning of this word Bodhi? Bodhi, you probably know already, comes from a root, a Sanskrit root, meaning to know or to understand. So Bodhi means therefore knowledge or understanding or wisdom or even enlightenment. Now traditionally in Buddhism we distinguish three kinds of Bodhi. I'll give you the technical terms for these, the names for these, and then we'll discuss them one by one. First of all, there is what is called Shravaka Bodhi, which we may translate as the enlightenment of the disciple. Secondly, there is Pratyeka Bodhi, which means private or individual enlightenment. And thirdly, there is what we call Anuttara Samyak Sambodhi, or unsurpassed, perfect enlightenment. Now, you've often heard me mention in the course of talks and lectures that in Buddhism there are many lists. And I've often had to emphasize the fact that a knowledge of these lists is very important, at least from a provisional intellectual point of view. Now this particular list, the list of these three bodhis, though very short, is extremely important. And I might even go so far as to say that without an understanding of this list, without an understanding of these three kinds of bodhi, there will be much in the development, in the history of Buddhist thought, especially in India, which we shall not be able properly to understand. Now let us just, first of all, try to see what is meant by these three different kinds of enlightenment, or bodhi. First of all, the Shravaka bodhi. Shravaka literally means one who hears. So it's the Indian Buddhist word for a disciple. A disciple is one who hears. Much more than that, one might say, he's one who listens. One who not only hears with the ear, but who hears within, who is receptive, as it were, to the teaching, receptive to the word of the teacher. So Shravaka Bodhi is the enlightenment of the disciple, the hearer. And it means that enlightenment, that illumination, which is gained from a teacher, not that which one finds out for oneself without any assistance whatsoever, but having heard from a teacher, having been shown the path by a teacher, having been taught the method, as it were, by a teacher, having been imparted the discipline by a teacher, one makes one's own effort, one's own exertion, and one gains enlightenment. So one's enlightenment is gained from or as a consequence of the instruction of a teacher. But after gaining that enlightenment, one makes no attempt to communicate what one has gained, what one has experienced, to anyone else. One has a teacher, but one has no disciples. So this is called the enlightenment of the disciple. Now, secondly comes pratyeka bodhi, private or individual enlightenment. Now, this enlightenment differs from the first one in being gained without a teacher. Here one finds out for oneself. One discovers the path for oneself. One doesn't have the benefit of the instruction of a teacher. That's why this type of enlightenment is considered very, very rare, because it's very difficult. One gains without the help of a teacher, and having gained, also, one makes no effort, no attempt to impart what one has gained, to communicate what one has gained to any other being. So this is what is known as private or individual enlightenment, pratyeka bodhi. Now, thirdly, the anuttara samyak sambodhi, or the unsurpassed perfect enlightenment, this too is gained without a teacher. But having been gained, it is not, as it were, kept to oneself. It is sought to be communicated to other beings by way of a teaching, so that they also may have the opportunity of sharing or participating in that experience of enlightenment which one has attained oneself. So this is the unsurpassed perfect enlightenment, anuttara samyak sambodhi. Now, even though it is said here in connection with this particular kind of enlightenment that it is gained without a teacher, it must be understood that this refers to the present life, the present existence. In previous lives there have been teachers, there has been a showing of the way, a showing of the path by others, and one has accumulated, as it were, sufficient momentum to be able to be carried through this present existence without a teacher, and to make the final, the ultimate discovery by oneself. So such are the three kinds of Bodhi: the enlightenment of the disciple, private or individual enlightenment, and the unsurpassed, perfect enlightenment. The first gained from a teacher, but not being imparted to any disciples or pupils. The second also being gained without a teacher, not being imparted. The third gained without a teacher in this life, but being imparted. So there are these three kinds of Bodhi according to the general Buddhist tradition, especially the Indian Buddhist tradition. Now, at this stage, there arises a very important question with very far-reaching consequences and very extensive implications. The question which arises is, what is the basic difference between these three kinds of Bodhi? In other words, when we speak of these three kinds of Bodhi, when we concern ourselves with them, are we concerned basically with three different types of spiritual experience? Three different types of enlightenment itself? Or are we concerned with one type of spiritual experience, one type of enlightenment, acting in three different ways, or occurring perhaps in three different contexts, or having three different sets of external relationships? In other words, is the difference between these three kinds of enlightenment, these three kinds of Bodhi, essential, or is it merely accidental? Some people undoubtedly, on studying first this question, coming across these three kinds of Bodhi, conclude that the difference is accidental, or even, one might say, adventitious. The three experiences are the same. What differs is merely the external relations, whether learned or not learned from another, imparted or not imparted to another. The experience itself is the same. This is the view which one naturally takes when one comes across this doctrine or this teaching for the first time. But actually it is not so. One may say, provisionally, that these three Bodhis represent three, as it were, grades of enlightenment within a single hierarchical structure, the third of which is the highest, the third of which is the crown and consummation, as it were, of the whole series. Now, if we want to simplify, to make the subject more comprehensible, we can say that there are not even three grades. We can say that there are just two. We can put the first and the second together and leave the third by itself. And we can say that in the first place there is the enlightenment of the disciple and the enlightenment of the private or individual enlightenment, and secondly, the unsurpassed perfect enlightenment. Just these two categories. Now, what is the difference between these two? On the one hand, the enlightenment of the disciple and the private or individual enlightenment. On the other, the unsurpassed perfect enlightenment. Looking at them as constituting two groups or two grades, what is the basic, the fundamental difference? Now, obviously, the difference lies in the relation of these two kinds of enlightenment to others, that is to say, to other people. In other words, of course, to the unenlightened, those who don't have that particular experience. So the first group consists of those who gain enlightenment with or without a teacher and don't impart it, don't communicate it. The second group consists of those who gain and impart or communicate what they have gained, what they have experienced. So this is the difference in relationship to others, whether the experience is communicated or not communicated. Now, this difference, we may say, is not accidental or not external, After all, in this particular context we're dealing not with material things, not with things which can be counted or divided, but with spiritual experiences, which is a very different matter. To take an example, supposing we have something material, say something precious, supposing we have, say, a precious stone, a jewel, supposing we happen to acquire it, to gain it. Well, we can keep it or we can give it away. But whether we keep it or whether we give it away, the jewel itself remains the same jewel. But when it comes to spiritual experiences, it isn't like that in the least. Because something far more subtle, something far more delicate, in a way, something far more complex is involved. So we can, as it were, lay down or formulate even a rule, a principle, or even a law. And we can say that a spiritual experience which can be kept, as it were, to oneself, is not the same as, is different from, one which has to be communicated, in the sense that it is an experience whose very nature involves that it should be communicated. Now, where does the difference lie then? The difference between these two kinds of spiritual experience, that which can be kept to oneself and that which must, as it were, be communicated. Now, the difference lies obviously in the feeling of selfhood. The feeling of selfhood, as you know, is a very common one. It has various forms. Some of those forms are very, very gross. Other forms are infinitely subtle. The grosser forms of selfhood are very easily detected. But the subtle ones, especially these very, very subtle ones, are extremely difficult to detect. So the subtlest of all forms of selfhood is that which occurs in connection with the gaining of enlightenment itself. We can have a certain experience, which we may take as an experience of enlightenment or something tending in that direction. But then there attaches itself to that experience a feeling or a further experience that this is my experience, in a sense that this is my enlightenment, this is what I have gained. And when that comes about, when that sort of experience or that sort of attachment of selfhood takes place, then we can think that it's not, or that it is possible not to communicate with others. Now this may be, from the mundane point of view, a very high, very sublime experience, but it is not the experience of unsurpassed perfect enlightenment, in other words, not the enlightenment of the Buddha himself. So long as that experience, so long as that feeling of my can be attached to it. If it is an experience about which we can think that it is my experience, then it is not that ultimate experience. Now, when we speak of conversion in Buddhism, in terms of the arising of the bodhicitta, that is the will to enlightenment, it's this second of the two kinds of enlightenment which is meant. In other words, the unsurpassed perfect enlightenment. Not the enlightenment of the disciple, not private or individual enlightenment. Sometimes, in this particular context, in this particular connection, it's called enlightenment for the sake or the benefit of all sentient beings. So in this particular context, in the context of this particular phrase or expression, the will to enlightenment is a will to unsurpassed perfect enlightenment. That is, to that enlightenment in which there does not inhere any shadow of selfhood, and about which, therefore, paradoxically speaking, one cannot even say that it is mine. So there is no question of keeping it to oneself. It has, as it were, to be imparted, communicated. So much, then, for the meaning of Bodhi, enlightenment. Now let us turn for a few minutes to the meaning of Citta. Citta is usually translated as thought. So we usually get, therefore, this expression, Bodhicitta Utpada, translated as the thought of enlightenment, as though it was a sort of concept or idea about enlightenment or on the subject of enlightenment. But this, we may say, is exactly what it is not. Nothing to do with thought in that discursive or abstract conceptual sense at all. We may say that the Bodhicitta, or the Citta, represents an immensely powerful drive, not an unconscious drive, but a drive in perfect awareness of one's whole being. So one therefore speaks, preferably, not so much in terms of a thought of enlightenment as of a will to enlightenment. Though even this isn't quite accurate, because it isn't just a determination in the ordinary sense, something infinitely more powerful than that, as we shall try to make clearer a little later on. So, Bodhicitta, will to enlightenment. Now, the third word in the expression is Utpada, Bodhicitta Utpada. Utpada means simply arising or development. Arising is the literal translation, so no need to explain this. Before we close, we shall try to describe the actual process itself. So the meaning of Bodhicitta Utpada, which I've rendered as arising of the will to enlightenment, should now be sufficiently clear. We may say that it represents that initial orientation of all one's energies, all one's strength, at all levels of one's being, all levels of one's personality, in the direction of enlightenment, understood as unsurpassed perfect enlightenment, that is to say, enlightenment for the benefit, for the sake of, for the welfare of all sentient beings. Now, to get back into the track, as it were, of this series, in what sense does this arising of the will to enlightenment represent a conversion? In what sense can it be spoken of as a conversion? We may say that it represents conversion within the field of Buddhism itself, from what we may call an individualistic conception or ideal of enlightenment to what we may call a non-individualistic conception or ideal of enlightenment. Or again, to change the form of words slightly, we can say that it represents a conversion from the experience of that kind of enlightenment which can be kept to oneself to that kind of enlightenment which cannot possibly be kept to oneself. In other words, it represents a transition, a breakthrough, if you like, from that last, most subtle sense of spiritual selfhood to a state, to an experience, to an awareness of complete, total selflessness. Now, obviously, this represents a very important aspect of conversion indeed. But it isn't so easy to deal with as the others, that is, conversion in the sense of going for refuge and conversion in the sense of entering the stream. It's less easy to deal with because it lends itself much less to what we may describe as cut and dried treatment or definitive treatment. You can't quite so easily put your finger on it and say, well, it's like this or like that, it occurs here, it occurs there. One might even say, in a sense, or in a manner of speaking, that this type of conversion, or conversion in this sense, can occur at any stage of spiritual development. or in connection with any spiritual experience. It's because of this that there is, in developed Buddhism or Mahayana Buddhism, a teaching or a practice of what is called turning over. Turning over, that is to say, of one's merits to the cause of perfect enlightenment. This is, I would say, one of the most important teachings in the whole of Buddhism. It's hardly ever mentioned. I remember some months ago, I think, if I'm not mistaken, it was at last year's summer school, I was delighted to hear one speaker refer to this doctrine and to stress its importance. But since then I've not heard it mentioned, unless I happen to mention it myself. It's a topic which is either ignored or unknown. But it is immensely important. In the Perfection of Wisdom corpus of scriptures and teachings, the Bodhisattva is advised, whenever you do any good action, whenever you practice morality, or whenever you meditate, whenever you help anybody, give anything, turn over the merit. Dedicate the merit to the cause of perfect enlightenment. In other words, when you do or when you have done that particular thing, that particular good action, don't even think. Don't even reflect that I'm doing this so that I can get liberation, so that I can get nirvana, so that I can become enlightenment. Say or reflect or resolve that this act of mine, the merit accruing or the merit deriving from this act of mine, this good deed of mine, I dedicate, I turn over, or better still, I sublimate into enlightenment, not just for my own benefit, but for the benefit of all. In this way, if one practices regularly and systematically, one ensures that in the course of one's spiritual life, one doesn't build up a subtle spiritual selfhood which eventually will stand and bar the way to one's ultimate spiritual attainment, that is the attainment of supreme or unsurpassed perfect enlightenment. The Bodhisattva is incidentally further told that this sort of turning over, this sort of transformation or sublimation of merit in the direction of unsurpassed perfect enlightenment is possible only on the basis of some insight into the doctrine or the teaching of shunyata, the voidness, as it's usually translated, but which really means the non-dual reality. So this practice of turning over one's merits accruing from various good deeds and so on should, as it were, accompany us all along the path. It's not anything that we do, as it were, once and for all. You do it today, you don't have to do it tomorrow. Or you did it last week and you can forget about it until next year. Nothing like that. It's something which you have to do all the time, which should accompany one's whole spiritual practice, one's whole spiritual life. So this is one thing, this is one way. But there's another way also. One can, if one so wishes, some people do so wish, pursue, as it were, spiritual individualism as far as it can possibly go. Think, as it were, grimly in terms of my enlightenment, nirvana. Disregard everything else. You can do this too. And you can get quite a long way. And when you've got rid of everything, as it were, when you've actually got your own individual enlightenment, and are, as it were, sitting down in it or on it, as upon some sort of throne, on some sort of celestial or transcendental pinnacle. And it's quite possible to do this. One can change then, and lift up one's eyes to that even loftier pinnacle of unsurpassed, perfect enlightenment. One can do this. But there's a danger. The danger being that one may get stuck. and stuck almost indefinitely in spiritual individualism, even at a very high level. One can get, as it were, into a spiritual cul-de-sac. So according to the general Buddhist teaching, it's better if conversion in this sense occurs early in one's spiritual life in the form of a decisive experience. That is to say, one doesn't just practice transference or turning over of merits with regard to one's ordinary everyday spiritual life and practice. Much less still does one pursue the path of spiritual individualism. But one, as it were, precipitates the arising of the will to enlightenment in the early stages of one's spiritual life, one's spiritual career, without settling down, even for a comparatively short period, in the path of spiritual individualism. Now, how does this happen? How does this come about? This rising or arising of the will to enlightenment or conversion in this sense. It is said to come about, or said to arise, as a result of a sort of conjunction, or sort of coalescence, between two trends of experience which are generally considered to be contradictory, which in ordinary experience in fact are contradictory, in the sense that you can't pursue both of them simultaneously. So what are these? These we may describe as, first, the trend of withdrawal, getting away, if you like, escape. The second, the trend of involvement, or immersion, or remaining in it. The first represents the movement of total withdrawal from mundane things. That is, renunciation in an extreme sense, extreme form. Withdrawing from the world, worldly activities, worldly thoughts, worldly connections, worldly associations, secular life, and so on. The movement of withdrawal. Now this movement of withdrawal is said to be aided by a particular practice which is called reflection on the faults, the imperfections, or the shortcomings of conditioned existence. You reflect that conditioned existence, phenomenal existence, life in this world, life within the round of existence, whirling round and round in the wheel of life, as it were, is not only not very satisfactory, it's profoundly unsatisfactory. All sorts of experiences one has of a very unpleasant nature. Things one wants, one can't get. People one likes, one is separated from. Things one doesn't want to do, one has to do. There's the whole wretched business of earning a living and looking after the physical body, feeding it, doctoring it when it gets sick, looking after family, wife, children, relations, employees, doing one's daily chores, so on and so forth. One feels that all this is too much. One has to get away from it all, out of it all. The round of existence itself is too much. Get away from it into nirvana, into a state where you don't have all these things, into the unconditioned, into the peace or the perfection of the unconditioned, into the rest, changelessness of the eternal, away from all the fluctuations, all the vicissitudes, all the distractions of this mundane life. So this is the reflection on the faults of conditioned existence, aided by which one withdraws, one opts out, as it were. One feels one's had enough of it, so one gets out. Now, the second trend, that is the trend of involvement, represents concern for sentient, for living beings. One thinks, one reflects, as it were. It's all right, yes, I'd like to get out. That would be all right for me. But what about other people? What's going to happen to them? There are some who can't stand it even as well as I can stand it. If I leave them, if I abandon them, well, how are they going to get on? So this trend, the trend of involvement, is aided by what is called reflection on the sufferings of sentient beings. In the first trend, the trend of withdrawal, one reflected on the sufferings of conditioned existence, the faults, the imperfections of conditioned existence, only so far as they affected oneself. But here, one reflects on them as they affect other living beings. One reflects, therefore, on the sufferings of sentient beings. You just take a look around. Just take a look around at the people you know, your friends, your acquaintances, the people you work with at the office, the people you meet in your places of recreation, clubs, societies, and so on. You just take a look at them. You think, or you reflect on all the troubles, all the difficulties which they have. There may be someone lost their job, doesn't know what to do. Some other person, marriage has broken up. Some other person had a nervous breakdown. Some other person been bereaved, maybe lost their wife or lost their child. So if you think, if you reflect, there's not a single person that you know who is not suffering in some way. Even if they're what is known as comparatively happy or happy in the ordinary sense, there are still things that they have to suffer. Separation or illness, even weakness and tiredness of old age, and finally death, which they certainly don't want. And if you cast your gaze wider, just look over the world. In so many parts of the world, so much suffering, wars, catastrophes of various kinds, floods or famines, especially in the East. Sometimes people dying in very, very horrible ways. Just think about the last war, people dying in concentration camps, people dying in gas chambers, all that sort of thing. You can cast your eye even further afield than that. You can think even of animals, how they have to suffer, not only at the hands of other animals, but at the hands of man. So you can see that the whole world of sentient living beings is involved in suffering. So much of it. So when one reflects in this way on the sufferings of sentient beings, one thinks, how is it possible for me to think simply in terms of getting out of it all? How can I think of getting away myself to some private nirvana, some private spiritual experience, which may be very satisfactory to me personally, but which doesn't do anything for them, which doesn't help them? How can I do this? So there's a sort of conflict if one's nature is big enough or rich enough to embrace the possibilities of such a conflict. On the one hand, one wants to get out. On the other, one wants to stay in. So the trend of withdrawal is there, the trend of involvement is there. So to choose either this or that, either to withdraw into spiritual individualism or to remain involved in a worldly sort of way, is easy. And many people do take the easier solution. Some get out, others remain in. Some get out into spiritual individualism, private spiritual experience. Others remain in the world, but not with much spiritual development or outlook, in a purely secular, mundane sense. Now, the whole point of what we're trying to explain and discuss today, this evening, is that though contradictory, both of these trends must be developed in the spiritual life. That is the trend of withdrawal and also the trend of involvement. One might say that the trend of withdrawal involves or embodies the wisdom aspect of the spiritual life, prajna. The other, the trend of involvement, embodies the compassion aspect, or karuna. So both of these are to be developed. That development is helped, that joint development is helped by what is known as the recollection of the Buddha. In other words, by constantly bearing in mind the ideal of unsurpassed perfect enlightenment, or enlightenment for the benefit of all sentient beings, as exemplified most perfectly by the Buddha himself, Gautama the Buddha, the human and historical teacher. Now, what one has to do is not to allow the tension, as it were, between these two to relax. If one does that, then in a sense one is lost. One has to pursue, one has to follow both, even though contradictory, simultaneously. The trend of withdrawal, the trend of involvement, getting out and staying in. Seeing the faults of conditioned existence, at the same time feeling the sufferings of sentient beings, developing wisdom and compassion. So as one develops, as one pursues, as one follows both of these simultaneously, the tension, as it were, builds up and up. It's of course not a psychological tension, but a spiritual tension. It's built up until a point is reached where one can't go any further. So when one reaches that point where one can't go any further, then something happens. What happens is very difficult to describe, but we may provisionally describe it as an explosion. This means that as a result of the tension which has been generated and accumulated by following these two contradictory trends simultaneously, there occurs a sort of breakthrough into a higher dimension of spiritual consciousness, where the two trends of withdrawal and involvement are no longer two. Not because they've been artificially amalgamated into one, but because the plane or the level on which their duality existed, or on which it was possible for them to be two things, has been transcended. So when that happens, when that explosion occurs, when one breaks through, as it were, one has the experience of being simultaneously withdrawn and involved, simultaneously out of it and in it. In other words, wisdom and compassion have become non-dual, not two. One can say one if one likes, but it's not a numerical or arithmetical one. So when this happens, when the explosion occurs, when the breakthrough occurs, when for the first time one is both withdrawn and involved, both out and in, having both wisdom and compassion, not as two things side by side, but as it were as one thing, then one may say that the Bodhicitta, or will to enlightenment, has arisen. And one can say that in truth and fact there has occurred a conversion from spiritual individualism to a life of complete selflessness. At least such a life has been initiated. So according to the Buddhist tradition, when that happens, when that takes place, one gives expression to the experience which one has gained, to that new dimension, as it were, of spiritual consciousness into which one has broken through, where one is both out and in, wisdom and compassion, in the form of what is known as 4 great vows. These are, of course, the vows, as many of you know, of the Bodhisattva. The Bodhisattva vows, in the first place, that he will deliver all beings from difficulties. This means difficulties not only of a spiritual, a religious nature, but even of a mundane nature. Secondly, he vows that he will destroy within his own mind and through his advice in the minds of other living beings all spiritual defilements. Thirdly, he vows that he will learn the Dharma in all its aspects, practice it, realize it in all its aspects, and teach it, impart it, communicate it to others. And fourthly, and finally, he vows that in all possible ways he will help to lead all beings in the direction of Buddhahood, that is unsurpassed perfect enlightenment. So when these 4 vows, the vows of the Bodhisattva, are made, then one's conversion in this sense, conversion in the sense of the arising of the will to enlightenment, may be said to be complete. Now in this talk, this evening, we've touched, as it were, on the very fringe of a very vast subject. It's very, very difficult to get these higher spiritual dimensions into a perspective which can be made the subject of communication on a more or less intellectual level. But enough, at least, should have been transmitted to enable one to have at least some inkling of what this is all about.